Out here, on the endless plains, loneliness can weigh heavier than a winter storm. She thought she'd spend the rest of her life mourning a love lost to tragedy, until the day a desperate, broad-shouldered stranger knocked on her door asking for nothing but a chance. What began as a simple act of kindness soon sparked a love neither of them dared to hope for, a love tested by gossip, guilt, and the unforgiving eyes of a small town. Before we dive into the story of risk, redemption, and unexpected tenderness, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if these true-to-the-bone love stories move you, don't forget to subscribe. Now, lean back and let the story carry you away. It's strange the way silence can scream at you. After Daniel died, that's what I remember the most. Not the funeral flowers wilting in the kitchen, not the endless casseroles from neighbors I barely knew, but the silence. It wrapped around the house like a heavy fog, turning every familiar room into a museum of what once was. And there I was, the lonely curator of a life that had ended, but still haunted every corner. I'd stand by the window most mornings, coffee in hand gone cold before I even took a sip, watching the fields stretch out under the pale dawn light. The land that Daniel and I worked so hard to build into something that could outlast us. Funny how quickly it started to feel like it would outlast only me. Some days I wished the sun wouldn't rise at all, just so I wouldn't have to face another day of pretending I was all right. It had been 3 months since the accident. The lawyers told me I'd be financially secure, as if that phrase could warm my bed at night or chase away the emptiness gnawing at my heart. What they didn't tell me was how every creak of the floorboards would sound like a ghost, or how the sight of Daniel's coat still hanging by the door would knock the air from my lungs. Grief isn't loud. It whispers, it lingers, and it carves you out from the inside until you barely recognize the person staring back from the mirror. One morning, as I stood at that window lost in thought, I noticed something strange, a dust cloud rising on the long dirt road that leads to the main house. Out here, visitors are rare neighbors, live miles apart, and don't drop by unannounced. My heart picked up a beat, torn between hope and dread. Maybe it was the delivery truck again, maybe it was just someone lost, but it wasn't. What stepped out of that old pickup truck was a man so large, he seemed almost unreal against the backdrop of my quiet Montana fields. Broad shoulders stretching a faded denim shirt, jeans worn at the knees, boots scuffed from long days of work. His hair was dark, sun-bleached at the tips, and a shadow of stubble lined his jaw. But what caught me most was the way he moved, not with the swagger of someone who knew his strength, but with a caution that almost looked like shame. I opened the screen door before he could knock, heart thudding so hard I thought he might hear it, and for a moment we just stared at each other. Me in my thin sweater and faded jeans, clutching a coffee mug like a shield. Him standing there, hat in hand, eyes that looked greener than any Montana pine, though tired and desperate. He introduced himself, though I barely heard the words over the roar of my own anxiety. I remember him saying he'd heard about my loss and that he was looking for work, that he'd been sleeping in his truck, going from ranch to ranch, but nobody wanted to hire him. Something about his size making people nervous. And I remember thinking how strange it was that a man so big who'd look so small in his own skin. My first instinct? Say no. Lock the door. After all, what kind of woman invites a strange man onto her property, miles away from the nearest help? But grief does strange things to your judgment, or maybe just cracks you open enough to see someone else's pain. I told him there was an old bunkhouse out back, hadn't been used in years and probably needed fixing up. He could stay there a few days while looking for work elsewhere. His shoulders relaxed a fraction, and in his eyes, I saw something like hope flicker like a dying fire suddenly catching a breath of wind. As he walked toward the bunkhouse, I stayed at the porch a moment longer, coffee forgotten, hands trembling. Watching that tall figure cross my yard felt like the first real change since Daniel died. And change, even small, is terrifying when you've been frozen in grief. That first week was a study in contradictions. I watched him from the kitchen window, telling myself it was only to be sure he wasn't stealing anything. But truth is, There was something mesmerizing in the way he moved, like a man used to being careful in a world that saw him as a threat. He fixed the fences Daniel had meant to mend last spring. He cleaned out the barn I couldn't bring myself to step into since the funeral. Every task he took on, he did with a silent determination that spoke louder than words. And at night, I'd see the light of his bunkhouse lamp glowing long after I'd turned mine off, and wonder what memories kept him awake. The loneliness didn't vanish overnight, of course, but it shifted, became softer at the edges. Knowing someone else was on the land, someone breathing, living, working it, eased a little of that crushing silence. One evening, after a long day of bookkeeping in the office, I walked past the bunkhouse just as he was finishing for the day. He wiped sweat from his brow, revealing a face roughened by sun and hardship, but younger than I guessed. His gaze met mine, and for a heartbeat, we stood there, two strangers bound by loss and survival more than words could explain. I kept walking, heart pounding, at the realization of something I hadn't dared to name. I wasn't just lonely. I missed being seen, and he saw me. Nights on the ranch can feel endless, especially when the wind howls down from the hills, rattling the windows and stirring old memories. Daniel's memory hovered everywhere: in the worn chair by the fire, in the fence post he fixed himself, in the rusted horseshoes by the barn door. Grief is a ghost that refuses to leave, a haunting of love left behind. But as days turned into weeks, my thoughts kept circling back to the man in the bunkhouse. I told myself it was just curiosity. After all, what did I really know about him, where he came from, what ghosts he carried? Still, every morning I'd catch myself glancing toward the yard before the coffee finished brewing, silently checking if he was still there. And every morning, he was steady, reliable, quietly working, as though the land itself had claimed him. One rainy evening, the storm rolled in earlier than expected. Thunder echoed off the hills, and sheets of rain blurred the fields into a watercolor of gray. I was lighting the fire when I saw movement through the window, him, soaked through, standing at the back porch, hesitation in every line of his posture. I opened the door before he could knock. Rain plastered his shirt to his chest, and his hair dripped onto the wooden boards. For the first time, he looked uncertain of his welcome. "Roof's leaking," he finally said, voice rough like gravel. "Didn't want to bother you, but it's coming in faster than I can patch it." I stepped aside and nodded toward the guest room down the hall. "Stay here tonight," I heard myself say, surprising us both. He hesitated, then nodded, mumbling a quiet thank you. As he walked past, the scent of rain and earth clung to him, and something deep inside me stirred a memory of warmth, of shared spaces and shared silences. That night, lying awake in my bed while thunder rolled across the plains, I realized something terrifying. My grief hadn't killed my heart after all. It had only put it into hiding. And now, without warning, it was waking up. They say grief is like a tide, it pulls back for a while, tricking you into thinking you've learned to stand on your feet again. And then, without warning, it crashes into you with all the weight of everything you've lost. I learned that lesson the hard way on a morning that began almost like any other. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the fields glistening under a pale, watery sun. I stood by the window, coffee in hand, the steam warming my face while my thoughts wandered where they shouldn't. I found myself thinking about him, about the way his eyes had met mine the night before when I offered him the guest room. There had been gratitude in his gaze, yes, but also something gentler, something I recognized too easily: loneliness. And maybe that's what scared me most. Not that he was a stranger, but that his loneliness echoed mine so perfectly. It felt like a dangerous mirror. When I stepped outside, the air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. The world always feels softer after the rain. I saw him near the barn, hammer in hand, patching up a board that had worked itself loose. He turned at the sound of my steps, offering a quiet nod, nothing more. And yet, that nod was enough to warm a part of me I'd thought frozen forever. I told myself it was kindness that made me walk over, that it was only fair to check if he needed anything after the storm. But truth be told, my heart was beating faster than it had in months. The distance between us felt charged, as though the damp morning air was thick with words neither of us dared to say. Over the following days, that quiet understanding between us deepened, unspoken but undeniably present. He never overstepped, never asked questions about Daniel or why I sometimes stopped mid-sentence lost in memory. But in small ways, he made space for me to breathe again. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, painting the sky with strokes of pink and gold, I saw him sitting on the porch steps of the bunkhouse, head bowed, hands clasped. Something in his posture spoke of a weariness beyond physical exhaustion or heaviness of the spirit that I knew too well. Without thinking, I walked over, a mug of tea in hand. He looked up, surprised, and for a moment his guarded expression fell away. "Long day," I murmured, offering the mug. He took it, fingers brushing mine, and the warmth of that brief touch lingered longer than I cared to admit. We sat there in silence, two silhouettes against the dying light. It struck me then how rarely silence between two people can feel comforting rather than suffocating. Daniel and I had shared that once, in the early years before grief, before the weight of running the ranch began to close in around us. I found myself telling him about those years, not everything but enough, about the laughter, the dreams we built together, and the accident that shattered them in a heartbeat. My voice trembled as I spoke, but he didn't look away. Instead, he listened the way the earth listens to rain, quiet, patient, and without judgment. When the words finally stopped, he didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss," the way so many others had, like reading from a script. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "Sounds like he was a good man." And that somehow meant more than any practiced condolence. Nights grew colder as summer gave way to fall. The fields turned golden and the trees at the edge of the property wore crowns of red and amber. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm shaped by his presence. I noticed the way the fences stayed mended, the tools neatly returned to their places, the horses calmer under his steady hand, the barn smelled cleaner, the yard looked tidier. Small things, perhaps, but together they wove a quiet testament to someone who cared enough to do them right. And through it all, my heart betrayed me, softening, opening, remembering how it felt to have someone to share the weight of each day. One crisp morning, I caught sight of him without his shirt, muscles shifting under sun-bronzed skin as he lifted a feed sack. The sight shocked me with its intimacy. I turned away quickly, but the image lingered, vivid and unwelcome. It wasn't just his strength that drew my gaze. It was the vulnerability that hid beneath it, the way his shoulders sagged when he thought no one was looking. That night, lying awake in bed, I found my thoughts drifting back to him, to the sound of his voice, low and gravelly, to the way his eyes softened when he spoke of his past. And I hated myself a little for it. Daniel had been gone only months. Was I so weak, so selfish, to want someone else already? But want him I did, and the guilt gnawed at me, sharp and relentless. Days turned into weeks, and autumn deepened its hold on the land. The first frost painted the pastures white, and I felt the ranch shift under the coming cold. One evening, as I sat by the kitchen table, bills spread before me like a battlefield, I heard footsteps on the porch. He knocked once, soft enough to leave the choice of answering to me. When I opened the door, he stood there, hat in hand as always. "Ma'am," he began, voice hesitant, "I just wanted to let you know the pump's fixed. Should hold through the winter." I thanked him, my words too formal, too distant for what I truly felt, but the distance felt safer, necessary. His eyes searched mine for something, invitation, perhaps, but I couldn't offer it. Instead, I mumbled something about an early morning and closed the door gently. Leaning against it, I pressed my forehead to the wood, breath shaking. On the other side, I heard him step off the porch, the boards creaking under his weight. And in that quiet, I realized how deeply his presence had already rooted itself in my days. One night, the wind rose fierce and wild, rattling the windows like a restless spirit. Memories of Daniel's accident flooded back, unbidden. I remembered the knock on the door, the sheriff's solemn face, the words that broke my world in two. Grief surged like a wave, dragging me under. In desperation, I stepped outside, drawn by the light in the bunkhouse. Rain whipped against my face, cold and sharp. My hand hovered at the door, heart hammering, before I forced myself to knock. He opened the door, surprise flashing across his face, quickly replaced by concern. Without waiting for an explanation, he stepped aside, letting me in. The bunkhouse smelled of oil, leather, and something unmistakably his. Warmth radiated from the small stove in the corner. For a long moment, I stood there, soaked and trembling, words caught behind a wall of fear and shame. Then quietly I whispered, "I didn't want to be alone tonight." He nodded, understanding without question. No words of comfort, no questions, just silent acceptance. He pulled a blanket from his bed and draped it over my shoulders, careful, gentle, as though afraid I might break. We sat on opposite sides of the small room, the storm raging beyond the walls. My gaze traced the calluses on his hands, the lines etched into his face, each one a story of hardship survived. And in his eyes, I saw something raw and unspoken, a tenderness that frightened me more than any loneliness ever had. When the storm finally eased, he walked me back to the main house, his large frame blocking the wind. At the porch, I paused, turning to face him. The words rose unbidden. "Why are you so kind to me?" He met my gaze, his voice low, almost hoarse. "Because you gave me a chance when no one else would." I wanted to say Moreto, tell him what his presence meant to me, how it had steadied a world that felt like it was falling apart, but the words tangled in my throat, trapped by fear and grief. Instead, I nodded, stepping inside before courage could betray me. Behind me, I heard his slow footsteps returning to the bunkhouse, each one echoing in the silence of the empty house. In the weeks that followed, the boundaries between us blurred in ways small but undeniable. Shared glances across the yard, brief, lingering touches when passing tools or mugs of coffee, moments of laughter that surprised us both. Each one stitched a thread of connection neither of us dared name. And yet the guilt remained a shadow, trailing every thought of him. At night, I'd lie awake, battling the ache of wanting something I told myself I couldn't have. Until the day everything changed. They say a heart that's been broken once learns to keep its secrets buried deep. And maybe that was true for me, but secrets, like seeds, have a way of pushing through the cracks when you least expect them. It was an early October morning, the first truly cold one of the season. Frost clung to the edges of the fence posts, and mist rose from the pasture like the breath of something ancient. I woke before dawn, unable to shake the dream that had haunted me through the night, a dream where I reached out across the kitchen table, but my hand met empty air. In that dream, I called Daniel's name, only to see his face blur and fade, replaced by another. The face of the man sleeping in the bunkhouse at the edge of my land. The guilt burned hot in my chest when I sat up in bed, the sheets tangled around my legs. How could I dream of him, this man I barely knew, when my husband's memory still walked these halls like a ghost? But try as I might, I couldn't deny the pull, and that terrified me more than anything. Later that morning, as the frost melted under the rising sun, I walked out to the barn. The air smelled of hay, old wood, and horses, a scent that usually calmed me, but my chest felt tight, breath catching with every step. He was there, of course always there, it seemed, fixing the latch on the main stall, hands steady, brow furrowed in quiet concentration. The early light caught the edge of his hair, making it look almost bronze, and for a moment, I had to look away, ashamed of how my heart betrayed me. He looked up, then catching my gaze, and in that silent exchange something shifted, a flicker of recognition, as though he too felt the invisible thread drawing us closer, tighter despite everything. "Mornin', ma'am," he said, voice rough from the chill. His breath curled in small clouds between us. I nodded, words failing me. Instead, I busied myself with the grain buckets, hands shaking more than I'd admit. I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of them as heavy as any hand, and I realized, with a sudden clarity, that nearly stopped my heart, that what scared me most wasn't the thought of wanting him. It was knowing deep down that he wanted me too. That afternoon, the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of winter. I watched him from the kitchen window as he moved across the yard, his steps measured, deliberate. A man who knew his own strength but carried it carefully, as though afraid to break the world around him. I thought about the way he'd listened to me that night of the storm, without judgment or pity, about the way his eyes had softened when I spoke of Daniel, as though my pain was his own. And I thought about how long it had been since anyone had looked at me like that, longer than I cared to admit. A few days later, as the sun set in streaks of crimson and gold, I found myself walking toward the bunkhouse. I told myself I had a reason to ask if he'd finished mending the west fence, but the truth sat heavy in my chest. I just wanted to see him. I paused at the door, breath caught in my throat. Before I could knock, he opened it, as if he'd sensed me standing there. He looked surprised at first, then concerned. "Everything all right?" "Yes," I lied, voice barely above a whisper. "I just needed to step away from the house." He nodded, stepping aside. "Come in if you'd like. Warmer in here." The bunkhouse was small, sparse, but clean. A simple bed, a table with a few tools and an old radio, a single chair by the stove. It felt oddly comforting, like stepping into a place where nothing was expected of me. I sat on the edge of the chair, hands clasped in my lap to still their trembling. He poured 2 mugs of coffee, the steam curling between us like a question neither of us dared to ask. For a while, we spoke of simple things. The repairs still needed before winter, the stubborn old mare who refused to be led anywhere. But beneath each word lay something unspoken, a heat that made the small room feel too close, the air too thin. At one point, our eyes met and held, and in that silence, the walls I'd built around my heart felt dangerously thin. "I should go," I said at last, voice unsteady. But I didn't move. He nodded slowly, setting his mug down. "All right." Still, neither of us stood. I don't know how long we sat there, caught between longing and fear. His gaze dropped to my hands, still clasped too tightly in my lap. And softly, so softly, I barely heard, he murmured, "You don't have to be afraid of me." The words hit something raw and tender inside me. "I'm not afraid of you," I whispered back. "I'm afraid of myself." He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said everything, that he understood, that he felt the same pull, the same fear. When I finally rose to leave, my knees felt weak. At the door, I turned back once, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, I knew we'd crossed an invisible line, one we could never uncross. The days that followed felt different, though nothing had truly changed. We worked the ranch together, spoke in quiet tones about feed schedules and repairs, but the silence between words spoke louder than anything. At night, I lay awake, hearing the wind creak the old boards of the house, imagining his breathing in the bunkhouse across the yard, wondering if he lay awake too, thinking of me. And each morning, I told myself I'd find a way to put distance between us. But each day, the distance grew shorter instead. One crisp morning, I found him by the corral, fixing a broken rail. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, breath misting in the cold air. Without thinking, I stepped closer, drawn by something beyond reason. When he looked up, our eyes met, and the world seemed to narrow until it was only us. I opened my mouth to speak, though I couldn't have said what, but the words caught in my throat. He beat me to it. "Don't," he said, voice raw. "Don't say it if you don't mean it." And in that moment, I realized I did mean it. Whatever it was, whatever this was. But before I could answer, the sound of a truck on the drive broke the spell. I stepped back, heart pounding as he turned away, shoulders tense. The truck belonged to my sister-in-law, Margaret, whose visits had become more frequent and less welcome. She had a way of looking at everything, including me, as though weighing its worth. She stepped out, coat sharp against the autumn wind, eyes falling immediately on him. "Who's that?" she asked, voice cool. "A hand I hired," I answered too quickly. She raised an eyebrow. "He looks dangerous." I bristled at the word. He isn't, I said, firmer than I meant to. Margaret's gaze lingered on me, sharp and knowing. Be careful, she warned. People talk. I knew she was right, but standing there, watching him walk back to the bunkhouse, I realized something that frightened me more than gossip. I no longer cared what people might say. That night, as the wind rose and rattled the windows, I stood at the sink, staring at my reflection in the glass. I barely recognized the woman who looked back, softer somehow but also stronger. A woman waking up from a grief that had defined her for too long. I thought of his words, "You don't have to be afraid of me." And I wondered what it might mean to stop being afraid, to let myself want what I wanted. For the first time in months, the thought didn't feel like betrayal. The next morning, I brought fresh coffee out to the yard. He was already at work, fixing the gate that had been hanging crooked since spring. When he saw me, his face softened into something that wasn't quite a smile, but close enough to make my chest ache. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied, holding out the cup. His fingers brushed mine as he took it, and the touch lingered, electric and terrifying. For a heartbeat, I wanted to speak, to say all the things trapped inside me, but the words caught, as they always did. Instead, I stood there a moment longer, letting the silence say what neither of us dared. And as I turned back toward the house, I felt his gaze on me, warm against the chill of the morning. That night, lying awake, I realized something simple, and yet as frightening as it was freeing. I wanted him, not just the way he looked at me, or the strength in his arms, but the gentleness behind it all. The kindness, the patience, the quiet understanding that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. And maybe, just maybe, he wanted me to. The thought settled over me like a promise and a threat all at once. Outside, the wind carried the first hint of winter, and somewhere across the yard, I imagined him lying awake too, caught in the same restless wanting. Some nights feel longer than they have any right to be, the kind where the house seems to breathe around you, whispering old regrets through every creak of the floorboards. Those were the nights I dreaded most, and they were becoming more frequent. Ever since that afternoon by the corral, when our eyes met and everything unspoken crackled in the air between us, I hadn't been able to find peace. I'd lie awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my heart beating too fast for a woman who had buried her husband less than a year ago. And yet, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The quiet strength in his shoulders, the patience in his gaze, the way his voice seemed to wrap around me like a promise. I was terrified of what it meant, and even more terrified of how much I wanted it. Autumn had settled in fully by then. The mornings came wrapped in fog, and the fields lay under a thin veil of frost until the sun burned it away. Each sunrise felt both like a beginning and a reminder that time kept moving forward, whether I was ready or not. I found excuses to be near him, bringing coffee to the barn, checking on repairs that didn't really need checking. Sometimes I'd watch from the kitchen window as he worked, the simple, steady rhythm of his labor oddly comforting. One morning, I caught sight of him by the fence, wiping sweat from his brow. The sight stirred something low in my chest, warm and frightening all at once. I turned away quickly, but not before our eyes met. In that brief moment, I knew he'd seen the truth I was trying so hard to hide. A few days later, I rode out to the North Pastoria ride I hadn't dared take alone since Daniel died. The air smelled of pine and cold earth, and my breath came out in soft clouds. As I neared the fence line, I saw him there, hammer in hand, repairing a broken rail. He looked up at the sound of the horse's hooves and nodded, but didn't speak first. It struck me how natural it felt now, being near him even in silence. "Fence holding up?" I asked, though I could see perfectly well that it was. "For now," he replied, his voice low and rough, like gravel warmed by sun. "Winter will be the real test." I nodded, unable to meet his gaze for long. "Thank you," I murmured, "for everything you've done." "Just doing my job," he said. But there was something in the way he said "ita" softness that made my chest ache. We stood there a moment longer, Words caught between us like birds afraid to fly. And then, before I could speak again, he returned to his work, the moments slipping away like water through my fingers. The days grew shorter. Evening fell like a curtain pulled too quickly, and the cold settled deeper into the bones of the house. I found myself lighting more lamps at night, as if more light might keep the shadows at bay. One evening, after a long day of paperwork and endless quiet, I walked out to the bunkhouse. The sky was streaked with deep indigo and the first faint stars. My steps felt heavy, my heart heavier still. When I knocked, he opened the door almost at once, as if he'd been waiting. "Evening," he said, stepping aside. Inside, the bunkhouse smelled of wood smoke and something faintly metallic like cold iron. He'd been repairing tools, the evidence scattered across the small table. "I hope I'm not intruding," I began. "You're not," he said quickly, the words sounding almost like relief. We stood there, the silence stretching between us, heavy with everything neither of us dared to say. At last, I found my voice. "Do you ever regret coming here?" I asked. He looked at me then, really looked, his gaze steady and unflinching. "No," he said, "not for a single day." Even with the talk, the words slipped out before I could stop them. "I've heard some," he admitted, his jaw tightening. "But it doesn't matter. Not to me." "Maybe it should," I whispered. "Maybe," he agreed, softer now. "But it doesn't." The weight of those words settled over me like a blanket. Part of me wanted to run to push him away, to protect myself from what was coming. But another part, deeper and truer, wanted nothing more than to stay. Later that week, I found Margaret waiting for me on the porch, her expression tight as a knotted rope. "You've got to be careful," she began without greeting. "I know," I said, though I barely meant it. "People are talking," she pressed, her voice sharp. "They're saying there's something going on between you and that man." "And what if there is?" The words shocked even me as they left my mouth. Margaret's eyes widened. "You're a widow," she hissed. "Barely a year. You'll ruin everything Daniel built." I clenched my hands at my sides. "Daniel is gone," I whispered, "and I'm still here. That doesn't give you the right. You don't need your permission." I cooed in, my voice trembling. Her mouth opened, then closed. She turned away, and for a moment, I thought I saw something almost like sadness in her eyes. "Just think carefully," she said at last, her voice softer. "You'll have to live with the consequences." As she left, I stood there, heart pounding, because I knew she was right. Whatever choice I made, there would be consequences. But for the first time in months, I wondered if I could bear them. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, my thoughts circling like restless birds. In the darkness, I let myself admit the truth I'd been denying. I wanted him, not as a hired hand, not as a passing comfort, but as something real, something lasting. The realization terrified me, and yet beneath the fear, there was something else too, a spark of hope I hadn't felt in so long I barely recognized it. The next morning dawned cold and pale. Frost covered the grass, turning the world into something sharp and beautiful. I found him by the old barn loading hay bales. His breath came in quick clouds, and sweat dampened the back of his shirt despite the chill. For a moment I just watched him, the strength in his arms, the quiet grace in every movement. Then, gathering courage I didn't know I had, I stepped closer. "I need to talk to you," I said. He paused, setting down the bale, and turned to face me. "All right." I swallowed, the words catching in my throat. "I can't stop thinking about you," I confessed, voice barely above a whisper. His eyes widened, and for a heartbeat I saw something raw and hopeful flash across his face. "I've tried," I continued, "but it's no use, and I don't know what to do." For a moment, he said nothing, and the silence felt so loud I thought it might break me. Then quietly, he spoke. "I've felt the same," he said, "since the day I got here." My breath caught, the world narrowing, until it was only us. "But it can't happen," I whispered. "People will talk. They already are." "Let them," he replied, voice firm. What we feel, it's real, isn't it? I looked into his eyes, saw the honesty there, the vulnerability, and I knew he was right. Yes, I said, it's real. We stood there so close I could feel the warmth of him even through the cold morning air. My heart pounded so loud I wondered if he could hear it. And in that moment, for the first time in so long, I didn't feel like a widow. I felt like a woman alive, wanting, afraid, yet ready to risk it. Then what do we do? I asked, my voice shaking. He exhaled, his breath a cloud between us. We figure it out, he said, together. And though fear still coiled in my chest, something softer wrapped around Ita's fragile, stubborn hope. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the life I'd built with Daniel. Safe, respectable, loved by everyone around us. And I thought about what lay ahead, whispers, judgment, maybe even scandal. But then I thought of him, his kindness, his steady hands, the way he looked at me like I was worth something, even now. And for the first time, I wondered if love and not reputation, not duty, might be reason enough. Outside, the frost sparkled under the moonlight, and I drifted into sleep with his face in my mind. Some mornings, the frost clung so stubbornly to the ground it felt like winter was refusing to let go. I'd step outside, the boards of the porch cold beneath my boots, and watch my breath curl into the pale sky. And every morning my gaze would drift toward the bunkhouse before I could stop it. I had told myself it was just routine, just habit, but deep down I knew better. Since that morning by the old barn fence, I'd spoken the truth out loud. Something had shifted inside me. The words had been like turning a key in a lock I'd kept closed for too long. And now, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't close it again. The days settled into an uneasy rhythm. We spoke more openly now, though always carefully, always aware of the eyes that might be watching. I'd bring him coffee when the wind bit through even the thickest coats, or step out to ask about the livestock, even when there was nothing new to say. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the window, a woman I barely recognized. There was a softness in my expression I hadn't seen in years, and something like hope tucked behind the worry. But hope, I was beginning to learn, can be a dangerous thing. It didn't take long before the whispers grew louder. At first it was just sidelong glances in town, voices lowered when I entered the feed store or the post office. Then it became sharper, polite greetings that felt brittle, forced smiles that didn't reach the eyes. One afternoon, as I was leaving the general store, I overheard two women faces half familiar from church talking just loud enough to be sure I'd hear. "She must be lonely," one said, voice dripping with pity so heavy it felt more like scorn. "Imagine bringing a man like that onto her land. And so soon," the other replied. "It's barely been a year, hasn't it?" My hands tightened around the bag of feed until my knuckles burned. I kept walking, head high, but inside I felt something crack. Shame, anger, and a stubborn streak of defiance all tangled in my chest. By the time I reached the ranch, my resolve had hardened into something sharper. I found him in the yard, repairing a gate hinge that had rusted through. When he saw me, he straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You look upset," he said gently. "People are talking," I blurted, the words tasting bitter. He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know. It's getting worse," I continued. "I heard them today. They think I've lost my mind." "And have you?" His voice was quiet, but there was something in his eyes, an earnest, searching question that made my heart ache. I opened my mouth, then closed it, because the truth was, maybe I had. Or maybe for the first time I was finally seeing clearly. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake listening to the wind, the old timbers of the house creaking softly, and thought about Daniel. I loved him. I would always love him. But loving someone who's gone doesn't mean you stop living. And yet guilt clawed at me every time I thought of what might come next. In the dark, I admitted something to myself I hadn't dared before. I didn't just want him near me. I wanted him with me, in every sense of the word. And that terrified me more than any gossip ever could. The next morning dawned gray and heavy with the promise of rain. I found him by the shed, oiling a stubborn latch. "I need to ask you something," I began, my voice barely steady. He looked up, patient, waiting. "Why did you come here?" The question spilled out before I could soften it. "Truly," he hesitated, then set the oil can down. "Because I had nowhere else to go," he said at last. "And because, when I saw you on that porch, I thought maybe this was a place where I could belong. And now," I whispered. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the tiny lines around his eyes, the wear of years spent fighting battles I'd never know. "Now," he said, voice low, "I stay because of you." The words hit me like a wave, knocking the breath from my chest. I'd known it somewhere deep down, but hearing it aloud made it real. "And what if I asked you to go?" I forced myself to ask. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Then I'd go," he said quietly, "if that's what you truly wanted." But I could see in his eyes that it would break him, and I realized with a jolt it would break me too. That evening, as the rain finally came down in soft, cold sheets, I stood by the window and watched him cross the yard toward the bunkhouse, shoulders hunched against the weather. The sight tugged at something deep inside me, something protective, tender, and undeniably human. Without thinking, I grabbed my shawl and stepped out into the rain. He turned at the sound of my boots on the gravel. For a moment, we just stared at each other, water dripping from the brim of his hat, my hair plastered to my forehead. "Come inside," I said, the words trembling on my lips. "I shouldn't," he replied, though his voice was thick, raw with something like longing. "Please," I whispered. Inside, the fire in the hearth glowed warm against the chill. We stood in the soft circle of light, the rest of the room falling away, until it felt like there was nothing in the world but us. My heart pounded so loud I was sure he could hear it. "I'm afraid," I admitted. "Of what?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Of what this means, of what people will say, of wanting you so much, it scares me." His eyes softened, and he stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the heat of him, even through the damp chill. "And do you?" he asked. "Do I what?" "Want me?" The question hung between us, heavy and undeniable, and though shame burned my cheeks, I forced myself to meet his gaze. "Yes," I breathed. The confession felt like stepping off a cliff, and for a heartbeat, I waited for the fall. But instead, there was only him, solid, real, and looking at me as though I was something precious. Slowly, he raised a hand, brushing wet hair from my face. The gentleness of it undid me completely. "I've wanted you since the day I saw you on that porch," he murmured. "But I'd rather leave tomorrow than hurt you." "You're not hurting me," I whispered. He closed his eyes for a moment, as though gathering every scrap of restraint. Then opening them again, he spoke with a softness that broke my heart. "Then tell me what you want." For a long moment, I couldn't speak. The fire crackled softly, the rain tapped at the window, and my breath came fast and shallow. And then, quietly, I said the truth I'd kept buried for so long. "I want you to stay," I whispered. "Not just tonight. I want you to stay with me." His eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief and hope crossing his face. "I want you here," I continued, my voice shaking. "Not as my hired hand, but as something more." The words tasted like fear and freedom all at once. He reached for me then, slowly, as if afraid I might vanish. His hand settled at my waist, warm and solid, and I let myself lean into him. In that moment, the world outside ceased to matter. The whispers, the judgment, the past. All that existed was this small space between us, and the fragile, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, we could build something real. I don't know who moved first, but our lips met, tentative and trembling. It wasn't perfect. It was messy and wet from the rain, our breaths uneven, but it was real-atchingly, beautifully real. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, both of us breathless. "I'm still afraid," I confessed. "So am I," he admitted, voice hoarse. "But I'd rather be afraid with you than safe without you." And for the first time since Daniel's death, I felt something deep in my chest, unclenched, like a door opening after being locked for far too long. That night, after he returned to the bunkhouse, I stood by the window, watching the rain ease into a gentle drizzle. My heart was still racing, but it wasn't fear that kept me awake, it was possibility. For the first time in so long, tomorrow didn't feel like something to dread. It felt like something to hope for. Mornings felt different after that night. I'd wake before the sun, wrap myself in my shawl, and stand by the window, watching the first light creep across the fields. And even in the hush of dawn, I could feel it, the quiet pulse of something new blooming between us, fragile and fierce all at once. It terrified me how quickly my heart began to shift, how easily I caught myself thinking not just of today but of tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, always with him in it. The days grew colder, the wind sharper, as autumn slipped toward winter. He worked tirelessly, patching the roof, splitting firewood, repairing fences I'd half forgotten even needed fixing. And every evening our eyes would meet across the yard, carrying 1,000 words we didn't yet dare to speak aloud. Some nights I'd walk down to the bunkhouse, carrying something warm as stew, a fresh loaf of bread, excuses thin as paper. We'd share a few words at the door, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear his replies. It wasn't quite enough, but it was something, and for a woman who'd been empty so long, even that felt like grace. In town, the gossip had grown teeth. At first it was sidelong glances, polite words wrapped around sharp curiosity. Then it turned to whispers that followed me through the aisles of the store, to words barely concealed. She's lonely, poor thing. It's not proper. What would Daniel say? God rest him. It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. One morning, I found myself standing frozen by the flour sack in the general store, staring at nothing, as two women just a few steps away murmured about me. My face burned, shame curling tight in my chest, and for the first time in months, I wanted nothing more than to run. That night, as I sat by the fire, the words wouldn't leave me. I kept hearing them like burrs caught in cloth, scratching every time I tried to breathe. When he came up to the house with an armful of firewood, his boots damp from the thawing snow, I couldn't stop myself. Maybe it's too much, I blurted, before he'd even set the logs down. He stilled, turning slowly. What is? This, I said, voice cracking. Us. People are talking. It's becoming too loud. His face fell, the weariness behind his eyes deepening. Do you want me to leave? I don't know what I want, I whispered, fighting back tears. I'm afraid of what people will think, what they'll say about me, about you. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the tiny flecks of silver at his temples, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. And what do you say about us? He asked softly. I swallowed, the words tangled behind my ribs. I say that I've been less lonely since you came, that I've remembered what it feels like to want someone beside me when the day ends. Silence stretched between us, heavy as iron. Then finally he nodded. Then let them talk, he said, voice rough but steady. I can take it. I just don't want you to suffer because of me. But I am suffering, I breathed. Not because of you, but because of what I'm afraid to do, of what I'm afraid to want. For a moment, I thought he might say more. Instead, he set the firewood gently on the hearth, turned, and left without another word. The door closed softly behind him, and the quiet that settled after felt sharper than any shout. Sleep didn't come easy that night. My mind kept circling back to that look in his eyes, a hope bruised by fear, a tenderness that made my heart ache. I thought of Daniel, of how I'd loved him, and how different this felt. With Daniel, love had been steady, calm, like a deep well. But with this man, it felt raw and unfinished, like something wild that might break us both, and somehow that made it feel all the more alive. And in the quiet dark, I let myself admit the truth. I wanted him, not just as a hired hand, not just as company, but as a man. As the man. The next day, a letter arrived. My sister Ruth had heard the whispers all the way in town, and she wasted no time putting her worry to paper. She wrote of concern, of reputation, of Daniel's memory. She reminded me that people could be cruel, that a woman alone had to protect what was hers. Her words were careful, loving, and heavy as a stone. I sat at the kitchen table, the letter trembling in my hands, and realized that everything she wrote I'd already told myself 100 times. Yet it didn't stop the ache that bloomed in my chest whenever I thought of him. 2 days later, Ruth came in person. She stood in my kitchen, her coat still dusted with snow, her brow furrowed in that familiar way. "I had to see you," she said, voice quiet but firm. "People are saying things, and I had to know from you. Is it true?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. The truth felt too raw to speak. "Do you care for him?" she pressed, softer now. "I do," I whispered. She exhaled, a sound half relief, half worry. "And does he care for you?" "He does," I said, voice shaking. "I think he does." Ruth looked at me for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, gently, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Then be careful, sister," she said. "People will always talk. Make sure it's worth the noise." That night, I stood at the window again, the bunkhouse light glowing faintly in the dark. My heart beat fast, as if trying to break free from my chest. I stepped out into the cold, the snow crunching under my boots, and knocked softly on the bunkhouse door. When he opened it, surprise flashed in his eyes, followed by something soft, a hope maybe, or fear. "Can we talk?" I asked, breath clouding in the air. He stepped back to let me in. Inside, the bunkhouse was spare but warm, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls. I stood by the hearth, gathering courage I didn't know I still had. "I've been afraid," I began, voice unsteady. "Afraid of wanting this, afraid of what it means." "I know," he said quietly. "But I'm more afraid," I continued, forcing myself to meet his gaze, "of waking up one morning and finding you gone, of letting fear steal something that might be good." For a moment he didn't speak. Then he took a slow step forward. "Do you want me to stay?" he asked, voice hoarse. "Yes," I whispered. "Not just tonight. I want you to stay, because I can't bear the thought of you leaving." The words hung in the air, heavy and true, and when he reached out, his hand was warm against the chill of my skin. Slowly, gently, he pulled me into his arms, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself lean into that strength, that warmth. Outside, the snow fell softly, blanketing the world in silence, but inside, my heart beat loud and sure. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or what the town would say, but in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was this: the weight of his arms around me, the steady thrum of his heart under my cheek, and the quiet, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, we could make something real out of this fragile beginning. The days that followed that night blurred together like brushstrokes on a canvas. Something had shifted, subtle but undeniable. The distance I'd so carefully kept between us had vanished in the hush of that cold night, replaced by a warmth I hadn't felt in years. He didn't move into the house, not yet, but there were nights when the wind howled so fierce against the windows that I'd find him at the back door, hat in hand, boots dusted with frost. And I'd simply nod, step aside, and watch him cross that last bit of distance between my loneliness and his. When he stayed, it was never spoken of in the morning. He'd slip out before dawn to start the chores, same as always. I'd lie awake in the quiet house, listening for the rhythm of his hammer on the fence posts, the soft creak of the barn door swinging open. Life went on as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Winter settled over the ranch like a thick blanket. The days grew shorter, the cold more cutting. I'd stand by the window, mug of coffee warming my hands, and watch him move through the snow, his broad shoulders stooped against the wind. Sometimes I'd catch him glancing back at the house, just a flicker of green eyes beneath the brim of his hat. And in those fleeting moments, I knew this wasn't some foolish passing fancy. It was real, raw, and dangerous in its truth. Of course, The world didn't stop watching. If anything, the whispers turned to open suspicion. People saw the way he stayed late, the way I lingered outside longer than necessary when he worked near the house, the way I'd send him into town for supplies instead of going myself, just to spare myself the eyes and the questions. One Sunday, after church, Mrs. Granger caught me just as I stepped down from the porch. Her mouth pinched tight, like she'd tasted something sour. "You know folks are talking," she said, voice low but sharp. "It's not decent, you being alone out there with a man like that." "A man like what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. Her eyes narrowed. "A drifter. Nobody knows where he came from or what he wants." I held her gaze, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. "I know what he wants," I said, my voice like flint. "Work. And he's earning every penny." She scoffed, turned on her heel, and left me standing there on the steps, the whispers trailing after her like the hem of her coat. That night he found me by the fire, my hands twisting a dish towel into knots. "I shouldn't have stayed," he said softly. "Not like this. I don't want to make trouble for you." "You're not," I said too quickly. I could see the disbelief in his eyes. "People are cruel," he murmured, sinking into the chair opposite me. The firelight caught the hollows under his eyes, the weariness that never fully left him. "They'll make you out to be something you're not." I stared into the flames, words catching in my throat. Maybe they would, maybe they already had, but for the first time in so long, I felt alive, felt seen, felt wanted. Was I really ready to give that up, to make other people comfortable? I set the dish towel down and crossed the space between us. I knelt by his chair, my hands wrapping around his. "Let them talk," I whispered. "I've been so afraid of what they'd say that I forgot what I wanted. And what I want is you." His eyes shone in the firelight, a storm of relief and longing and fear. He squeezed my hands like he was afraid I'd slip away if he let go. A week later, I drove into town myself. I did it on purpose, tired of hiding in my own skin, tired of letting the whispers corner me into shame. I stood in line at the post office, feeling the eyes on my back like needles. When Mrs. Granger walked in behind me, I turned, met her stare head on, and offered a calm, polite smile. "You know," I said, my voice steady, "it's a cold winter. A woman can't keep up a ranch alone. I'm glad to have help." Her mouth twitched, as if she'd bite down on a reply. But she didn't say a word, she just turned away, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The small victories didn't stop the rumors, though. If anything, they spread further, fueled by the audacity of a widow daring to want more than what grief allowed. My sister Ruth came again, this time bringing a casserole and a pile of worries. She sat at my kitchen table, studying me like she was searching for cracks in my resolve. "Is this really what you want?" she asked finally. "You could still sell the ranch, come stay with me for a while, start fresh." I thought of the fields at dawn, the hum of work in the air, the steady presence of him beside me when I woke in the night. I thought of how he laughed when I teased him about the holes in his boots, how his touch felt like safety and danger all at once. "No," I said, "I'm not leaving." She sighed, a mix of exasperation and love. "Then at least be careful. Don't let him ruin you." I smiled then, a small, secret smile she didn't quite understand. "He's not the one who could ruin me," I said quietly. "Loneliness is." After she left, I found him by the barn, fixing a broken latch. His hands were red with cold, but he looked up when he heard my footsteps crunching through the snow. "Your sisters still think I'm no good for you?" he asked, half a grin tugging at his mouth. I shrugged, leaning against the fence. "She thinks I should be careful." He straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Maybe she's right." I stepped closer, my breath a cloud between us. "Maybe she is," I agreed, "but I'd rather be reckless with you than careful and alone." His laugh then soft, surprised, full of something that tasted like hope. He reached out, brushing a cold fingertip against my cheek. "You're braver than I am," he murmured. "No," I said, my hand wrapping around his. "I'm just tired of being scared." When the first true snowstorm of the season hit, it came like a white wall, burying the pastures under drifts taller than the fences. We spent hours together hauling feed to the cattle, shoveling pathways, checking the barn for leaks. At night, when the wind howled so loud it rattled the windows, he stayed in the house without pretense. He made a bed for himself on the old settee near the fire, but more often than not, I'd find him standing in my doorway, silent, as if asking permission. And each time, I'd lift the covers, and he'd cross the floor like a man crossing an ocean he never believed he deserved to reach. It wasn't easy, it wasn't perfect. Some mornings I'd wake to find him gone before dawn, the sheets cold beside me. He'd work the fields as if he could outrun the judgment of a world that didn't want him to belong. I'd catch him sometimes, standing by the back fence, staring off toward the road that led away from here, his shoulders hunched against a weight I couldn't always lift. And when I asked him what he was thinking, he'd just shake his head, murmur something about how nothing good ever stayed for him. I'd wrap my arms around him then, press my face to his chest, and pray that maybe this time something good would. It was during one of those storms, when the house felt like an island in an ocean of white, that he asked me what I really wanted. We were sitting by the fire, my head resting on his shoulder, the wind singing through the eaves. "What do you see for yourself?" he asked, voice rough from the day's cold. "When this is all over, when winter breaks." I closed my eyes, imagining it. "I see you here," I said softly. "I see this ranch alive again. I see the fields green come spring. I see laughter in these rooms. Maybe children's footsteps someday." His arm tightened around me, his breath catching. "Don't say that unless you mean it," he whispered. "Don't give me dreams I shouldn't have." I lifted my head then, met his eyes, steady and sure. "I'm not giving you dreams," I said. "I'm telling you what I want, and if you want it too, stay." He didn't answer with words. He didn't need to. The way he kissed me then said more than any promise ever could. And so we stayed, two souls, foolish enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could weather this storm together. Outside, the wind howled, the snow fell, and the world waited to see if we'd break under its gaze. But inside, by the fire, I found something stronger than the fear that had held me hostage for so long. I found him, and for now, that was enough. Winter didn't let up. If anything, it grew harsher, like the land itself wanted to test whether we truly belonged here together. Snowdrifts swallowed fence posts whole. Ice glazed the barn roof so thick it glittered like polished stone under the pale sun. And still, day after day, he rose before dawn, shoulders bowed under the weight of cold and expectation alike. I watched him from the kitchen window, steam curling from my coffee, each morning wondering what it would cost us to keep pretending we were nothing more than widow and hired hand. Every glance across the yard felt heavier, every silence stretched a little longer. And though neither of us dared say it aloud, the truth between us had grown too large to hide. There was a day, mid-January, when the wind bit so sharp it made your teeth ache. I'd driven into town for feed, something I'd have sent him for before, but now I did it myself. Part of me thought it would keep tongues from wagging. Part of me needed to prove to myself I could still stand alone, even if my heart had chosen otherwise. I walked into the co-op, snow still clinging to my coat. The chatter inside faltered as I stepped through the door. I felt the hush settle over me like frost. "Morning, Mrs. Hartwell," the clerk said, his smile too polite to be real. "Morning," I answered, forcing my voice steady. "I need 2 sacks of corn feed and a new length of chain." As he wrote it down, I could feel the stares behind my back sharp as briars. When I turned to pay, Mrs. Granger was there, lips pursed, eyes full of something colder than the winter outside. "You know what they're saying," she began, not bothering with pleasantries. "A widow taking in a man like him, and what is he exactly?" I asked, though my voice shook. "He works hard. He keeps the ranch running. A man like that wants more than work," she said, her words falling like stones. "And a woman alone like you, well, it don't look right." I swallowed hard, anger rising through the fear. Maybe what it looks like isn't your business, I said, softer than I felt. Maybe it's mine. For a heartbeat, silence. Then she turned away, but the damage was done. The whispers would double now. I'd fed the fire instead of putting it out. That evening, I told them, we sat by the hearth, boots drying by the door. They know, I said, they're sure of it now. He didn't look at me right away. I'm sorry, he murmured. I should go. His words sliced through me quicker than any gossip could. No, I said, my voice catching. That's not what I want. But it's what you need, he insisted, eyes finally meeting mine. And in them I saw sorrow I recognized all too well. They'll ruin you over this. I'm already ruined, I whispered. Ruined by wanting you here. Wanting this life. Wanting something that isn't proper or polite. The fire popped, sparks floating up like tiny prayers. He reached across the space between us, calloused fingers brushing my cheek. And what if I stayed? He asked, voice hoarse. What if I stayed, knowing it'd cost you everything? Then it would be worth the cost, I said. I'd never spoken truer words in my life, but saying them didn't make the fear vanish. If anything, it made it real. Now there was nothing left to hide behind. We both knew what we wanted, and the world around us wasn't going to make it easy. The days that followed felt like walking a rope over an abyss. Every trip into town was another chance for rumor to tighten its grip. Every time someone glanced too long at my left hand, I half expected them to ask why it was still bare. And still, every night, I chose him. Chose his warmth in the dark, his quiet strength, the way he spoke to me with his hands and eyes when words felt too dangerous. One night after supper, I found him by the barn, lantern hanging from a nail, his breath fogging in the cold. He was staring at the sky, stars sharp and bright above the snow. They all think I'm using you, he said before I could speak. That I'm nothing but a hungry dog begging at your door. And what do you think? I asked, stepping closer. He turned, his face shadowed but his eyes fierce. I think you saved me, and I think I'm falling in love with you for it. My heart thundered so loud, I was sure he could hear it. Then don't leave, I whispered. I won't, he promised, voice ragged. Even if it means facing every lie they tell. We stood there in the cold, breath mingling like a single prayer, and for a moment it felt like the world outside the barn walls didn't exist. But it did, and it came knocking sooner than either of us were ready. It was Patricia who showed up first, her coat still dusted with snow, face flushed from the drive. She didn't bother with greetings, just stepped into my kitchen like she owned the place. Have you lost your mind? She demanded. I set the kettle down, hands trembling. Patricia, please. You're embarrassing yourself. Embarrassing Charles's name. Taking in some drifter who could be anyone, could do anything. He's not some drifter, I shot back louder than I meant to. He's a good man. A good man? She spat. You don't even know where he came from. I know enough, I said. I know he's kind. I know he works hard. I know he's better to me than anyone else has been in years. Her voice softened then, a cruel mercy. You're grieving, that's all this is. And when the grief fades, you'll see what a fool you've been. I'm not grieving him anymore, I whispered. Not like that. And maybe that's what scares you. Her eyes narrowed. If you keep him here, people will cut you off. They'll stop coming to you for business. They'll stop inviting you to church. You'll lose everything. Then let me lose it, I said, my voice breaking, but my resolve holding. I'd rather lose the town than lose myself. When she left, the silence in the house was louder than any argument. He found me by the sink, hands braced on the porcelain, breath ragged. I heard, he murmured. I meant it, I said, turning to him. I don't want to hide anymore. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin even in the cold kitchen. Then don't, he said. Don't hide. Let them see. So I did. The next Sunday I walked into church with him by my side, his hat in his hand, shoulders squared, chin lifted, though I could see the fear in his eyes. The hush that fell over the pews was sharp as a slap, but I didn't flinch. I walked to my usual seat, his arm brushing mine as we sat. And though the sermon that day barely reached my ears, the sound of my own heart pounding did. When it ended, we stood to leave, and Mrs. Granger caught my eye, lips curled into something between pity and scorn. I lifted my chin and met her gaze, and for the first time I didn't look away. The world didn't fall apart. Not right then, anyway. The sun still rose over the frozen fields, the cattle still lowed for their feed, the wind still rattled the barn doors at night, but it wasn't easy. Some neighbors stopped waving when they passed on the road. Orders at the feed store were misplaced more than once. I caught whispers in town that stung worse than the cold. But every night, when I came home, he was there, and every morning, when the sky barely hinted at dawn, I woke to the sound of his boots on the floorboards, and it felt worth it. One evening, weeks later, we sat on the porch, breath frosting in the night air. He stared out at the moonlit fields, jaw tight. "You shouldn't have to fight for me," he murmured. "I'm not fighting for you," I said. "I'm fighting for us." His eyes flicked to mine, surprise softening the lines of worry on his face. "Us," he repeated, like it was a word he'd never dared speak aloud. "Yes," I whispered, "us." And in the quiet that followed, something settled between you, something stronger than fear, older than grief, deeper than shame. That winter, the ranch felt more alive than it had in years. Together, we mended fences the snow had broken, fixed the barn roof before the spring melt could ruin it. At night, we sat by the fire speaking of small things, weather, cattle, the stubborn pump that still leaked, but beneath it all pulsed a promise neither of us dared put fully into words. Until one night, when the wind had calmed and the world outside felt still, he took my hand, callous fingers rough but gentle, and said, "If I asked you to make it permanent, would you?" My heart stumbled, breath catching in my throat. "Make what permanent?" I whispered, though I knew. "This," he said simply, "us." And in that moment, all the fear, the gossip, the weight of the past fell away. "Yes," I said, voice soft but sure. "Yes." His shoulders sagged with relief, a quiet, trembling laugh slipping from his chest. "I don't have much to give," he said, eyes glinting wet in the lantern light. "You've already given me more than anyone else ever has," I answered. And as he pulled me into his arms, the world outside felt far away, its judgment, its whispers, its doubts. In that embrace, there was only the truth of what we'd built, the fragile, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, we could keep it. They say love makes you brave. Maybe it does. But what they never tell you is that before it makes you brave, it makes you terrified. It strips you bare, peels back every careful layer you built to keep the world out, until there's nothing left but the raw, trembling hope that someone might see you, truly see you, and stay. That's what it felt like in the weeks after I told him yes, a strange, trembling peace that wrapped itself around my heart. But peace isn't the same as safety, and in a town like ours, safety was always a fragile thing. The first sign of trouble came quietly. A canceled delivery here, a supplier who suddenly stopped answering calls. The feed store claimed they were out of stock, though I'd seen the pallets stacked out back. When I pressed, the clerk wouldn't meet my eyes. "Maybe you should take your business elsewhere," he muttered, voice low. I drove home that day with my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. The wind howled across the open fields, snow swirling around the truck like restless ghosts. By the time I pulled into the drive, I could feel the panic pounding in my chest. He was waiting by the porch, wiping oil-stained hands on a rag, face creased with concern the moment he saw me. "What happened?" he asked. "They won't sell to me anymore," I whispered. "They're cutting us off." His jaw tightened, that familiar muscle jumping in his cheek. "Because of me." "No," I said quickly, though we both knew it was true. "Because of us." That night, I lay awake listening to the wind batter the windows, the old house creaking under the weight of winter. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow darker. Beside me, his breathing was slow, steady, the warmth of his body an anchor in the cold. I thought of Charles then, of the quiet, predictable love we'd shared, of the respectability that had wrapped around me like a heavy coat, safe, proper, but never alive like this. Guilt twisted in my chest. Was I betraying his memory by loving someone else, by wanting a future he could never give me? I turned toward the sleeping man beside me. His face, softened by sleep, seemed younger, almost vulnerable, and I knew, with a certainty that left me breathless, that this was no betrayal. Charles had given me years of steady companionship, but this man, this stubborn, scarred, impossibly gentle man, had given me something I'd never dared hope for, a chance to live, not just survive. Morning came, pale and cold. Over breakfast, he spoke quietly. "I've been thinking," he began, not meeting my eyes. "Maybe I should go." The words hit me like ice water. "No," I said, sharper than I meant to. "Don't say that." "I can't stand watching them turn on you," he said. "It was different when it was just me they hated, but you—" "I don't care what they think," I interrupted. "I care about what we think." He shook his head. "You might not care now, but when the bills come due, when they won't buy your cattle or your grain, you'll care." "I've lived my whole life caring what people thought," I whispered, "and it made me lonely. I won't go back to that." Finally, he looked at me, green eyes dark with worry and something deeper. "Then what do we do?" "We keep going," I said, "together." But together didn't make the world kinder. One afternoon, while he was mending the north fence, a truck pulled up by the gate. I recognized it at once. Sheriff Lawson. His face was carved from suspicion and wind. "Morning, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Mind if I have a word?" I stepped onto the porch, heart thudding. "What is it, Sheriff?" He cleared his throat. "There have been some complaints. Folks saying they've seen things." "Things?" I echoed. "Things that don't look proper. A widow living alone with a man like that." My hands clenched at my sides. "A man like what exactly?" "You know what I mean," he said. "Big fella, no family, no past anyone can vouch for. Folks get nervous." "Let them," I snapped, surprising even myself. "He's done nothing wrong." "Doesn't always matter," the sheriff said. "Word is, the co-op might refuse to buy your calves come spring. The bank might evaluate your credit." My throat went dry. "And what are you saying, Sheriff?" He looked away, voice low. "I'm saying you've made your choice, and now you have to be ready to live with it." After he left, I stood there on the porch, staring out at the snow-blind yard. The cold seeped into my bones, but the real chill was inside me. He came up from the pasture, coat dusted with frost, expression wary. What did he want? I swallowed hard. To warn me about the town, about the bank. He studied my face as if weighing every unspoken word. "And what do you want?" he asked. "You," I whispered. "Still you. Even now." His shoulders relaxed, just barely. "Then I won't leave," he said, quiet but certain. "Not unless you tell me to." "I never will," I answered. As winter turned toward spring, the land softened under the thaw, but for us the weight only grew heavier. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid us. Church pews that once welcomed me felt colder, emptier. Invitations stopped coming. Phone calls went unanswered. One evening, I found him by the fence line, staring out at the horizon where the fields met the sky. The wind tugged at his hair, and the setting sun turned the snow to pale gold. "I could give you your life back," he said, voice low. "All I'd have to do is leave." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "My life is here, with you." "And if we lose everything?" he asked. "The ranch, the cattle, the name your family built?" "Then we start over," I said, my voice cracking. "As long as we start over together." He turned, and in his eyes, I saw the fear I'd been trying to hide in my own heart, that love alone might not be enough. But then he took my hand, and the warmth of his touch steadied me. "We can face them," he whispered. "And if we can't?" I asked. "Then at least we'll fall together," he said. Spring came late that year, the thaw reluctant, the mud thick as doubt. But with it came something else, life. Lambs bawled in the pasture. calves stumbled to shaky legs, and within me a quiet miracle had begun, a life so small it barely made sense, yet already changing everything. It was early one morning when I knew. I'd been feeling sick for days, brushing it off as worry and too many sleepless nights. But standing in the kitchen, the pale dawn filtering through lace curtains, I felt a shift inside me, a flutter, soft as hope. I pressed a hand to my belly, breath caught in my throat. Could it really be? I didn't tell him right away. Part of me was afraid of what it would mean, of how it would tie us together even more tightly in a world determined to pull us apart. But one night, as we sat on the porch watching lightning dance across the far hills, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "There's something I need to tell you," I began, voice shaking. He turned to me, eyes searching. "What is it?" I think I'm pregnant." For a moment, silence. Then something raw and beautiful crossed his face: astonishment, fear, wonder, and finally a joy so fierce it left me breathless. "Truly?" he whispered. I nodded, tears spilling before I could stop them. He reached out, hand trembling, resting gently on my belly. "Thank you," he breathed. "Thank you for trusting me with this." That night, lying in his arms, I felt something shift deep inside me. For so long, I'd lived as if love was a debt to be paid, grief a burden to be carried alone. But this was different. This was ours. Unasked for, unexpected, but ours. And for the first time, I let myself imagine a future. A child's laughter echoing across the fields, his large hands guiding small ones, my own heart lighter than it had been in years. A family, not the one I'd planned, but the one I'd chosen. And so, despite the gossip, despite the cold shoulders and closed doors, we began to build. Together, we repaired what winter had broken. We planted new seed in fields half the town claimed we'd lose. And every night, as the sky turned dark above us, we chose each other again. Love didn't make the world kinder, but it made us stronger. And as spring greened the land around us, I realized maybe that was enough. I always thought love stories ended with a wedding, as if vows spoken under a church roof were the final chapter. But I was wrong. A wedding is never an ending. It's only the moment when two hearts decide to stand together, no matter how loud the world shouts at them to step apart. And in our case, the world had started shouting louder than ever. News travels fast in a small town, faster still when it carries the sweet scent of scandal. My growing belly was a secret that could only stay hidden so long. By midsummer, whispers spread like wildfire through church aisles, grocery store lines, and the dusty back roads where neighbors met to trade news and judgment. "She's pregnant. With him? And they're not even married." I heard it in the clipped tones of old friends who no longer called, saw it in the narrowed eyes of women I'd shared pews and potluck dishes with for years. Even at the feed store, the clerk's polite nod had stiffened, replaced by a tight-lipped look that said more than words ever could. One morning, after I'd loaded the truck for town, he stopped me on the porch. His face was shadowed by worry, deep lines etched from days spent bracing against the world's weight. "Let me come with you," he said. I shook my head. "No, it'll be worse if you're there." He hesitated, then placed a hand on my belly, so gentle it made my heart ache. "I just don't want you to face them alone." "I'm not alone," I whispered. "Not anymore." His gaze held mine, so full of things left unsaid, and in that silence I felt both our fears and our stubborn hope. The trip to town felt longer than it had in years. I parked outside the grocery, heart pounding as I stepped into the cool, stale air of the store. Heads turned, conversations paused mid-sentence. A woman I'd known since childhood glanced at my stomach, then quickly away. Each look felt like a stone thrown, but I kept my head high, reminding myself of the life growing inside me and the man waiting back home. At the checkout, the cashier, a girl barely old enough to remember my late husband, couldn't meet my gaze. Her hands trembled as she bagged my groceries. "Thank you," I said softly. She nodded, eyes darting around, as if afraid kindness might be seen. Driving home, I let the tears come, silent, salty proof that no matter how strong I tried to be, the hurt still found a way in. When I pulled into the yard, he was already there, wiping sweat from his brow, watching me with that quiet, steady concern. "How bad?" he asked. I tried to lie, but my voice broke. "Worse." He opened his arms, and without a word, I stepped into them. For a moment, the weight slipped away, replaced by the simple truth of his embrace. Later that evening, we sat together on the porch as the sun sank low, painting the fields in copper and gold. The breeze carried the scent of dust and wildflowers. For a while, we said nothing, letting the silence speak. Then, softly, he began. "I've been thinking about leaving." My chest tightened, panic flaring. "Why?" "Because I can't stand seeing what this is doing to you. To us. If I go, maybe they'll forgive you. Maybe the baby won't grow up under their stares." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "Don't say that. It'd be easier." "For who?" I cut in. "For them? For the people who already decided what kind of woman I am? No. I won't raise our child teaching them that love should be hidden, or that fear should decide our future." He looked at me then, really looked, and what I saw in his eyes broke my heart and healed it all at once. A man who'd spent his life believing he wasn't enough, too big, too rough, too poor to be loved without shame. "I'm not leaving," he said finally, voice raw. "Not unless you ask me to." "I never will," I said, tears slipping free. "I love you, all of you, and I'm done hiding it." He took my hand, his callous fingers trembling. "Then let's do it." "Do what?" "Marry me, properly. Let them talk. Let them shout, we'll shout louder. Let's give this baby our name, our home, our truth." For a moment, fear rose like a tide. The memory of Charles, of the life I'd once had, of all the voices whispering that this was wrong. But then I thought of the mornings waking beside him, the evenings spent in quiet laughter, the child growing within me, half him, half me, entirely ours. "Yes," I whispered, "yes." Relief and joy crashed over his face, and he pulled me close, pressing his forehead to mine. "Thank you," he breathed, "for believing in me." "It's not just belief," I whispered back. "It's love." The next morning we drove to the courthouse in the nearest city, far enough that the clerk didn't know our names. I wore a simple dress, the color of new cream, and he wore his only suit, shoulders straining at the seams. The ceremony was brief, but when he said, "I do," his voice shook, and I saw the weight of what it meant. Not just a vow to love me, but a vow to stand against a world that had never welcomed him. When it was my turn, the words came softer than I'd meant, but truer than anything I'd ever spoken. "I do." And with that, we became something new. Not widow and drifter, not scandal and shame, husband and wife. Driving home, his hand stayed on mine the whole way. The road felt different, like it belonged to us now. The fields, the fences, even the dusty mailbox at the end of the lane seemed to welcome us back. We pulled into the yard, and for a heartbeat, everything was quiet. Then the screen door slammed, and the wind caught the hem of my dress. And in that ordinary moment, the extraordinary truth settled in my chest. We had chosen each other, openly, fearlessly. Of course, the town noticed. Some faces turned away completely, others watched with thinly veiled curiosity, but there were small kindnesses. To a neighbor who left a basket of eggs on the porch, a nod from an old rancher at the co-op, as if to say, "You're still one of us." We couldn't change everyone's minds, but we no longer needed to. At night, lying in bed, he'd rest his hand on my belly, feeling for the faintest kicks. "What if it's a girl?" he'd ask, voice hushed. "Then she'll have your strength," I'd say. "And your heart," he'd reply. In those whispers, we built something stronger than acceptance, hope. Summer turned the fields golden, and life began to settle into its new shape. There were still hard day storms that flooded the pasture, rumors that burned hotter than July sun, but there was laughter too. Shared coffee at dawn, his big hands mending fences, then brushing sawdust from my shoulders. The baby's first kick felt beneath the sky, wide enough to hold all our fears and all our dreams. And slowly, the fear began to fade. Not completely, but enough. Because in the end, love didn't silence the world. It simply taught us to speak louder. I used to think the hardest part of this story would be the choice, to open my heart to a man who arrived at my door with nothing but hope in his eyes. But I was wrong. The hardest part came later, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the waiting turned into something raw and real. The summer had slipped into fall almost unnoticed, the heat giving way to cooler evenings, the fields around the ranch softening to shades of rust and gold. My belly had grown round and heavy, each kick from within a reminder of everything we'd risked, everything we'd chosen. I spent hours sitting on the porch, hands resting on that gentle curve, watching the wind bend the tall grass. Sometimes he'd come join me, boots scuffing on the boards, settling his large frame into the chair beside mine. We wouldn't always speak. We didn't need to. Love had given us a language beyond words. Then came the night the child decided to arrive. The pain started slow, ripples of discomfort that stole my breath but didn't frighten me. I'd known this was coming. Still, when the contractions grew sharper, I caught myself searching for his face in the half-light, needing the steadiness I always found in him. He was there, always. Strong hands braced at my back, a voice low and steady in my ear. "You've got this. I'm right here." It was in those moments, sweat cooling on my skin, pain rolling through me like thunder, that I understood what love really meant. Not the flutter of new affection, not the soft words whispered at night, but this, standing shoulder to shoulder when life tests your strength, knowing the other won't flinch. The midwife came, her arrival a flurry of towels and warm water. The hours stretched into a haze of pain and exhaustion. At times I thought I couldn't go on. At times I heard myself say it aloud. But every time doubt crept in, he was there. "I'm here," he'd say. "Look at me." And I would. And somehow the storm would feel survivable again. Then, at last, a cry, small and fierce and impossibly alive. The midwife wrapped the baby, pressed the tiny bundle into my arms. My vision blurred with tears as I looked down and met eyes so new to this world, yet so familiar it made my heart ache. "He's perfect," I whispered. The midwife smiled. She, actually. I laughed then, a sound torn from somewhere deep inside, a laugh of relief, of wonder, of a love so sudden and consuming it felt like it might break me. He knelt beside me, shoulders hunched as if afraid to lean too close, his large hands hesitant. "May I?" I nodded. Carefully, he cupped the baby's head, his fingers dwarfing her delicate features. His breath caught, and when he looked at me, his green eyes were wet. "She's so small," he murmured. "And so ours," I whispered. For a man so often judged by his size and strength, the tenderness with which he held our daughter was the quietest miracle of all. We named her Clara, after my grandmother, a woman of quiet courage, whose love had once anchored me. It felt right to pass that name forward, to tie our daughter to the strength of women who came before. The days that followed blurred together, soft cries in the night, the scent of warm milk, the fragile weight of new life resting against my chest. Sleep was brief, often stolen in small moments, while he watched over us both. He built a cradle by hand, smoothing the wood until it gleamed. I'd wake at night to find him leaning over it, callous fingers tracing the curve, a look on his face I'd never seen before, reverence. Outside, the ranch kept breathing, the cattle grazing in the dawn light, the fence lines waiting for repair. Life went on, indifferent to our little world turned upside down. But inside the house, everything had changed. I found myself studying his face as he cradled Clara, the way his features softened, the lines of hardship easing in her presence. He'd hum under his breath, quiet melodies carried from some forgotten childhood, and Clara would settle against him, tiny hand curled in his shirt. In those moments, I saw the boy he'd once been, the boy who'd lost his parents too soon, bounced between strangers who saw his size but never his heart. And I realized he wasn't just learning to be a father, he was learning what it meant to belong. Word of Clara's birth spread quickly, as news always does in small towns, and though some whispers carried the same old judgment, others brought unexpected warmth. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by. leaving a basket of baby clothes on the porch. No note, just kindness left quietly, as if to say, "We see you, we see the love here." Even Patricia, who had been so sharp and certain in her disapproval, arrived at our door. She stood awkwardly, her gaze darting to Clara, then to us. "I came to meet my niece," she said, voice softer than I'd ever heard. And in that moment, something fragile mended between us, not forgotten but forgiven. As the weeks turned into months, the days found their own rhythm. Clara grew, her gaze curious, her cries fierce. She had his eyes, deep green and searching, and when she smiled, it was as if the whole house brightened. We'd walk the fields together, me, him, and Clara nestled against my chest. The wind would tug at my hair, and I'd glance over to see him watching us, that quiet pride in his eyes. "I never thought I'd have this," he'd say sometimes. Neither did I, but here we were. At night, we'd sit on the porch, Clara asleep inside. The sky stretched above us, endless and full of stars. The same sky that had once felt so lonely now felt like it belonged to us too. "Are you happy?" he'd ask. I'd rest my head on his shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I am." "Truly?" "Yes," I'd whisper. "Truly." And I was. Not because the world had changed, but because we had. We'd chosen love over fear, family over silence. In quiet moments, I still thought of Charles. Not with guilt anymore, but with gratitude. His love had shaped a part of me, but it hadn't been the end of my story. I knew now that love could come twice in a lifetime, different but no less true. And when I watched my husband with Clara, when I felt her tiny hand wrap around my finger, I understood. Grief and love can live side by side. One does not erase the other. Instead, they make us whole. Winter came, blanketing the ranch in white. We spent evenings by the fire, Clara curled against my chest, his arm around my shoulders. Outside, the wind howled across the fields, but inside there was warmth, laughter, and the steady, quiet certainty that we were exactly where we were meant to be. "I used to think I wasn't enough," he told me one night. "You always were," I whispered. "It just took someone brave enough to see it." "And you?" he asked. "Are you still afraid?" "Sometimes," I admitted, "but never enough to regret this." In the end, ours wasn't a perfect story. The world didn't magically forget its judgment. There were still cold glances, still words muttered behind hands. But the difference was this: they didn't matter anymore. Because in this house, on this land, we had built something real, something that couldn't be undone by gossip or doubt. Love had come to us not as a grand, sweeping gesture, but as quiet persistence. A man knocking on a door he had no right to, a woman brave enough to open it. Looking back now, I see that it wasn't luck that saved us. It was choice. Every day, we chose to stay, to hope, to love. And in the end, that was enough. As for Clara, she grew in a house that taught her that family isn't defined by blood or by the past, but by love freely given and fiercely defended. She learned that the world can be harsh, but that kindness, once chosen, becomes a shield stronger than any fence. And when she asked years later how her father and I had met, I told her the truth. That love arrived on our porch one morning, worn and desperate, and we were brave enough to let it in. Under Montana's skies, among fields that had once felt so empty, we built a life full of laughter, forgiveness, and hope. And though the road here had been lined with grief and fear, it led us somewhere neither of us had dared to dream home. If you were standing where she stood, would you have fought the same fight? Tell us what you would have done in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it moved you. And if you're still in the mood for stories of love, loss, and second chances, explore the other videos waiting for you on the screen. Thanks for watching, and until next time, ride safe.